The carriage wheels stopped outside Penvarra Hall, and Alina Marchetti's hands went cold before she even saw who stepped out of it. She had spent 6 years inside these walls believing she was safe. Safe from the world that took her parents. Safe from the loneliness that swallows children who have nowhere else to go. The old Duke had given her that safety without ever asking for anything back, and she had built her whole life on the quiet promise that Penvarra was home. But the old Duke was gone now, and the man walking up the front steps, tall and unfamiliar in the way that changed men become unfamiliar, was his son. Alaric Penvarra had left for the war when Alina was barely 18. He had written to her twice in 6 years. She remembered him as a restless young man who laughed too loud and left rooms too quickly. The man in front of her now moved like someone who had learned to measure every step. She smoothed her dress and walked out to meet him, chin high, the way she had trained herself to do for every guest, every relative, every person who might look at her and wonder why an orphan girl still lived in a duke's house. "Alina," he said, and stopped on the last step, studying her the way a man studies a room he used to know and no longer recognizes. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said, and the title felt strange in her mouth. She had called him Alaric once when they were both young enough that titles didn't matter. Something flickered across his face. "Don't call me that, not you. It's proper now." "It's ridiculous now," he said, and for a moment the old warmth broke through, the boy she remembered showing beneath the composed stranger. "You practically raised half this household while I was gone. You don't owe me formality." She should have felt relief at that. Instead she felt something sharper, something she didn't have a name for yet, standing there while the staff unloaded his trunks and the autumn wind pulled at her sleeves. He studied the hall behind her, the polished floors, the fresh flowers in the entryway, the ledgers she had clearly kept in perfect order. "You've kept this place alive," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure what I'd find coming back." "Someone had to," she said. "Your father asked me to look after it. I didn't want to fail him." "You didn't fail anyone." He stepped closer and she caught the change in his eyes, something searching, something that hadn't been there when he left. "Look at you. I left a girl in this house. I've come home to a woman running an entire estate." 6 years will do that." 6 years, he repeated, as if testing the number, as if trying to understand what had been lost inside it. That evening, at the long dining table where he now sat at the head instead of his father, Alaric watched her direct the staff with quiet authority, watched her correct a young footman's mistake without embarrassing him, watched the way every person in that room looked to her before they looked to their new duke. "You run this house like it's yours," he said, when the servants had cleared the plates. "I only manage it, it's yours." "Is it?" he said, so softly she almost missed it, and when she glanced up he was already looking away, back into the fire, his jaw tight with something he wasn't ready to say. She told herself it was nothing. Grief does strange things to a man returning to an empty father's chair. She told herself the flutter in her own chest was nothing to old familiarity, nothing more, the comfort of a face she had known since she was a girl. But that night, lying awake in the small room that had been hers for 6 years, she found herself listening for his footsteps in the hall the way she used to listen for his laughter as a boy, and she hated how much she still wanted to hear it. The next morning she found him in the study, surrounded by ledgers, rubbing his eyes like a man who hadn't slept. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, setting down a tray of tea before he could object. "I'm not alone," he looked up. "You're here." "I mean the estate, the accounts. I can show you everything your father taught me." "I know you can, that's not what I meant." He set down his pen. "Alina, do you know what it was like out there thinking about this house? I used to picture you exactly like this. Standing in a doorway with tea, telling me I don't have to do things alone." Her breath caught, quick and involuntary, before she forced it back down. "I imagine you thought of many people while you were away." "Not like this," he said, and the words hung there unclaimed, too dangerous for either of them to pick up. She poured the tea instead, hands steady through years of practice at looking calm when she wasn't. "You should eat something. You look like you haven't slept since you arrived." "I haven't." He watched her over the rim of his cup. "The house is too quiet without my father in it, and too loud with all these new feelings I don't know what to do with." "Feelings about the estate." "Among other things," he said, and something in his voice made her look away first. Over the following days, they fell into rhythms that felt achingly familiar: walks along the garden paths at dusk, long conversations by the fire that stretched past midnight, the easy laughter that had defined their childhood friendship returning like it had never left. The staff began to whisper, the way staff always do, about how the new Duke seemed lighter, warmer, more himself whenever Miss Marchetti was in the room. Alaric noticed the whispers too. He noticed the way his cousin Edmund raised an eyebrow whenever Alina's name came up. He noticed the questioning looks from the housekeeper, the careful silences from the butler. And every time he noticed, he told himself the same thing. "She is like a sister to me. She is family, nothing more." He repeated it so often that he almost believed it. Almost. One evening, walking beside her through the garden as the sky turned the color of embers, he stopped near the old stone bench where they used to sit as children, back when his father was alive and the world felt simpler. "Do you remember this bench?" he asked. "I remember you fell off it trying to prove you could stand on one foot," she said, smiling despite herself. "I remember you laughed for a week. You deserved it." He laughed too, a real laugh, the kind that reached his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, just stood there in the fading light with 6 years, and 1,000 unspoken things stretched thin between them. "I missed this," he finally said. "I missed you, Alina. More than I think either of us are ready to admit." Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I missed you too. Of course I did. We grew up together." "Is that all it is, growing up together?" The question sat heavy in the cooling air. She wanted to answer honestly. She wanted more than anything to close the distance between them and let herself believe that 6 years of longing had not been one-sided. But she had learned long ago what happened to girls who forgot their place in houses like this one, girls who mistook kindness for something more and paid for the mistake with everything they had. "You're the Duke now," she said quietly, "and I'm the ward your father took in out of kindness. We should remember what that means." Something shuddered behind his eyes, quick and painful. "Is that truly how you see it, after everything?" "It's how it has to be," she said, and walked back toward the house before he could see how much the words cost her. He stood alone in the garden long after she'd gone, staring at the bench where 2 children used to sit without a single thought for titles or propriety or the invisible walls that grow up around people as they age. He told himself, again, that what he felt for her was simple, familial, safe. But standing there in the dark, watching the light in her window flicker on, he knew, somewhere beneath the careful denial, that the word family had never once described what he felt when he looked at Alina Marchetti. He simply wasn't ready yet to say what did. 3 nights later, his Aunt Cordelia arrived for an unannounced visit, sweeping into the drawing room with the particular energy of a woman who had traveled specifically to interfere. "Alaric, darling," she said, settling into the best chair with practiced ease, "we must discuss your future. The season is nearly upon us, and a duke without a duchess is a scandal waiting to happen." Alina, arranging flowers near the window, kept her back very straight and her hands very steady. "I've only just returned home, Aunt Cordelia. There's time enough for that." "There is never enough time in matters of succession." Cordelia's sharp eyes swept the room and landed, inevitably, on Alina. "And what of your little ward here? Surely it's time we thought of her future as well. A girl her age, unmarried, living under a bachelor duke's roof. People will talk, Alaric, if they haven't started already." The silence that followed felt like the drop before a fall. "Alina is like family to me," Alaric said, too fast, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, before he could weigh what they would cost. "I'll always look after her. There's no scandal in that." Cordelia sniffed, unconvinced but willing to let it go for now, and moved on to describe the eligible young ladies of the coming season in exhausting detail. Alaric nodded along, distracted, watching Alina's hand still completely over the flowers she'd been arranging. She did not turn around. She did not need to. The words had already landed, precise and final, closing a door she hadn't fully realized was open until she felt it shut. Like family, he'll always look after her. Not a woman he watched cross a room with something unnamed in his eyes. Not someone he'd stood beside in a darkening garden, asking questions neither of them dared finish. Just a ward, a responsibility, a kindness extended out of duty rather than desire. She finished the flowers with hands that did not shake, because she had spent 6 years teaching herself not to shake, and excused herself from the room with a composure that cost her everything she had left that evening. Alaric watched her go, and something in his chest twisted painfully, though he could not yet name why his own words felt like a mistake the moment they left his mouth. That night, Alina sat by her window long after the house had gone quiet, looking out over the gardens where 2 children once played, without knowing that the world would someday draw lines between them. Neither had chosen and neither, perhaps, truly wanted. She thought of the bench. She thought of his voice asking, "Is that all it is?" She thought of the word family, spoken so easily, so publicly, so final. She did not cry. She had trained herself long ago not to cry over things she could not change. But she made a decision that night, quiet and resolute, staring out at the dark garden below. If she was only ever going to be family to Alaric Penvarra, then she would need to find a life that offered her something more. Somewhere in the world beyond these walls, there had to be a place where she was not a duke's ward, not a kindness extended, not a responsibility to be managed. Somewhere there had to be a place where someone could simply choose her. She did not know yet that the choice would come sooner than she expected, or that it would arrive wearing the face of a stranger with no title at all, only warmth and honesty, and none of the careful distance that had come to define every conversation inside Penvarra Hall. But the seed of that future had already been planted, in the silence after 4 careless words, in a drawing room where a duke had spoken without thinking, and a girl who loved him had listened without breaking. The story of what came next would decide whether Alaric Penvarra learned the truth of his own heart before he lost the one person who had ever made this house feel like home, or whether he would spend the rest of his life understanding, too late, that some words once spoken cannot be gently taken back. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, and Alina read it twice before she let herself believe it was real. It came from a charity society in the village of Ashcombe, a modest operation that fed and clothed families left destitute by the recent floods along the river. They needed someone to help organize donations, someone with a steady hand for numbers and a willingness to work long hours for very little thanks. Alina had written to them on impulse. The same night Cordelia's visit had rearranged something inside her, and she had almost forgotten she'd sent the letter at all. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her sleeve before anyone could ask what had put the color back in her cheeks. She did not tell Alaric right away. For 2 days she carried the secret through the halls of Penvarra like a small, private fire, something warm that belonged only to her in a house where everything else, even her own name in some rooms, seemed to belong to someone else's decision. It was Edmund, of all people, who nearly gave her away. "You seem different this week," he said one afternoon, finding her in the library with a book open but unread in her lap. Edmund was Alaric's cousin, a pleasant, unremarkable young man who had always treated Alina with an easy kindness that asked nothing in return. Lighter, somehow. "Do I?" "You do," Alaric's noticed too. He mentioned it at breakfast, though he pretended he hadn't. Her stomach dropped in a way she didn't want to examine. "He shouldn't concern himself with my moods." He concerns himself with everything about you, Edmund said, not unkindly, watching her with the patient curiosity of a man who saw more than he let on. I've known my cousin his whole life, Alina. I've never seen him watch anyone the way he watches you. He watches me because I run his household. Edmund's mouth curved, not quite a smile. If that's what you'd like to believe. She did not answer, and Edmund, sensing he'd pressed as far as he should, changed the subject to safer things, the weather, the coming harvest, his mother's insistence on hosting a ball before the season properly began. But his words stayed with her long after he'd gone, turning over and over in her mind until she finally admitted, alone in her room that night, that she was tired of pretending not to notice things. She was tired of watching Alaric across a dinner table and wondering what he meant by every glance. Tired of replaying the garden conversation, the unfinished question hanging in the dusk. Tired, most of all, of the 4 words that had settled into her chest like a stone and refused to move. Like family. That was all she would ever be, however he looked at her, however warm his voice grew when they were alone. He had said it plainly in front of witnesses in a room where the truth mattered more than comfort. She believed him. She had to believe him because the alternative that he had said it out of fear, out of habit, out of some cowardice neither of them had named, was a hope too dangerous to carry. So when the reply came from Ashcombe confirming her position, she did not hesitate. She began her arrangements quietly, meeting with the society's coordinator on days when the household duties allowed her an hour's absence, telling the staff only that she was assisting with charity work in the village, which was true enough not to raise questions. Alaric noticed her absences before she was ready for him to. "You've been gone most afternoons this week," he said, finding her in the front hall as she removed her traveling cloak, cheeks still flushed from the ride back from Ashcombe. "Where do you go?" "The village. There's a charity helping families affected by the flooding. I offered to help with the accounts." Something crossed his face, surprise, and beneath it, something closer to worry. "You didn't mention this." "I didn't think it required your permission." "It doesn't," he said quickly. "I only meant it's admirable. I simply wish I'd known." "You know now," she said, and moved past him toward the stairs, aware of his eyes following her the entire way, aware, too, of how much she had wanted once for that same attention to mean something more than it apparently did. The days at Ashcombe became the brightest part of her week. The work was hard and unglamorous, sorting donated linens, counting coin by candlelight, comforting mothers whose homes had been swallowed by the river, but it belonged entirely to her. No one at Ashcombe called her a ward. No one there measured her worth against a title she would never hold. She was simply Alina, capable and steady, and the families she helped were grateful in a way that asked for nothing complicated in return. It was there, on a gray afternoon in her 3rd week of volunteering, that she first met Julian Hale. He arrived at the charity house with a cart full of supplies, flour, blankets, tools for rebuilding purchased, she would later learn, entirely out of his own pocket. He was not tall in the way Alaric was tall, nor did he carry himself with the practiced elegance of a man raised inside a great house. He moved through the crowded room with the easy confidence of someone who had built his own life from nothing and answered to no one but himself. "You must be the famous Miss Marchetti," he said, setting down a crate near her table. "The coordinator speaks of you like you've single-handedly saved this operation from collapse." "She exaggerates," Alina said, though she couldn't help the small smile that rose unbidden. "I only keep the numbers straight." "Someone has to." He wiped his hands on his trousers and extended one toward her. "Julian Hale. I deal in timber and grain mostly, though lately I seem to deal mostly in flooded riverbanks and complaining farmers." She shook his hand, and something about the gesture, simple, direct, without the layered meaning she'd grown used to reading into every touch at Penvarra, felt like a small relief. "Alina Marchetti." "I know," I asked. He grinned, unbothered by his own forwardness. Figured a woman running this whole operation, deserved to have her name known properly. She laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh surprised out of her. "You're very direct, Mr. Hale." "Life's short, Miss Marchetti. I've never seen the sense in being anything else." Over the following weeks, Julian became a fixture at Ashcombe, arriving with supplies, staying to help with the heavier labor, and always finding an excuse to work near wherever Alina happened to be. He asked her questions no one at Penvarra ever thought to ask, not about the estate, not about her duties, but about her, what she liked, what she dreamed of, whether she'd ever wanted a life beyond the walls she'd grown up inside. "I don't know," she admitted one afternoon, watching him stack crates with an ease that made the work look effortless. "I've spent so long thinking about what I owe to other people that I'm not certain I know what I want for myself." "That's a shame," he said, setting down the last crate and turning to face her fully. "A woman like you should know exactly what she wants, and if she doesn't yet, she should have the chance to find out without anyone telling her what she's allowed to want in the meantime." No one had ever said something like that to her before, not with such simple certainty, without any weight of obligation attached. She found herself looking forward to Ashcombe more than she looked forward to anything at Penvarra now, and she told herself it was only the work, only the freedom of a place where her worth wasn't measured against a title. She told herself the warmth in her chest whenever Julian's cart appeared on the road was simple gratitude, nothing more. But back at Penvarra, Alaric had begun to notice things he didn't like. She came home lighter now, her cheeks touched with sun, humming under her breath as she went about her duties in a way she hadn't in months. He told himself he should be glad for it. He told himself that whatever had put that light back into her eyes was good, was healthy, was none of his concern. And yet each evening, watching her across the dinner table, he found himself wondering where exactly that light had come from, and why the wondering left him feeling something dangerously close to jealousy over a feeling he had insisted, only weeks before, was nothing more than family. "The village work suits you," he said one evening, unable to help himself, watching her over the rim of his glass. "It does," she agreed. "I've never felt more useful." "You're useful here too." "It's different," she said carefully. "Here I'm useful because someone needs the household managed. There I'm useful because I chose to be. It matters, the difference." "More than I expected it to." He wanted to ask what else had changed there, wanted to ask about the color that had returned to her face, the lightness in her step, the way she seemed lately to be someone slightly out of his reach for the first time in 6 years. But the question felt too close to admitting something he still wasn't ready to say aloud, and so he let the silence answer for him, and watched her retire early, humming softly, entirely unaware of the storm quietly building behind his composed expression. Edmund found him later that night, alone in the study with a glass he hadn't touched. "You look like a man who's lost something," Edmund observed, settling into the chair across from him. "I haven't lost anything." "Not yet," Edmund said, with the particular patience of a man who had watched this exact story unfold in 100 quiet ways before. "But you're about to, cousin, if you keep insisting to everyone, including yourself, that what you feel for that woman is nothing more than family. Words like that have a way of becoming true whether you mean them or not." Alaric said nothing, staring into the fire, and Edmund, recognizing a battle his cousin wasn't ready to fight, left him alone with his silence and his slowly dawning fear that somewhere in the village of Ashcombe, Alina Marchetti was quietly building a life that no longer required his permission, his protection, or his presence at all. The chapel bells were ringing when Alaric rode into Ashcombe that Saturday morning, though he told himself, even as he guided his horse down the muddy lane, that he had come only to check on the charity's progress, only to see with his own eyes where his household funds had been going since Alina began her weekly donations from the estate coffers. It was a reasonable thing for a duke to do. It had nothing to do with the restless night he'd spent turning Edmund's words over and over, until dawn broke gray outside his window. He told himself this all the way into the village, and he almost believed it until he saw her. Alina stood outside the chapel steps in the pale morning light, her bonnet loose around her shoulders, laughing at something the man beside her had said. She had one hand resting easily on his arm, the way a woman rests her hand on someone she trusts completely, and the man, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, dressed in the plain good wool of a working merchant rather than the fine cut of a gentleman, was looking down at her with an expression Alaric recognized instantly, because he had spent the last several weeks fighting the exact same expression on his own face and losing. The horse beneath him stopped without Alaric quite deciding to stop it. He sat there in the lane, unnoticed, watching the woman he had called family across a crowded drawing room stand in the open street and glow, absolutely glow, in a way she had never once glowed at Penvarra, not for him, not for anyone he had ever seen inside those walls. Her laugh carried across the square, bright and unguarded, and the sound of it struck him harder than he was prepared for. "Who is that?" he asked the stable boy who had ridden alongside him, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. The boy followed his gaze. "Julian Hale, your grace, timber merchant, does a fair bit of trade with the mill outside town, good sort from what I hear, gives half his profits to the flood relief. And Miss Marchetti knows him well." The boy shrugged, too young to sense the danger in the question. "Seen them together most Saturdays this past month. Whole villages taken to talking about it, if you'll forgive me saying so, your grace." Alaric said nothing. He watched Julian Hale lean down to say something close to Alina's ear, watched her laugh again and swat lightly at his arm in a gesture so easy, so natural, that it could only have come from weeks of practiced familiarity. He watched the two of them turn together and walk toward the charity house, Alina's hand still resting on Julian's sleeve, and something in Alaric's chest twisted so violently he had to grip the reins to steady himself. He did not go into the village that day. He turned his horse around at the edge of the lane and rode home at a pace that left the stable boy struggling to keep up, and he did not speak a single word the entire way. That evening, Alina returned to Penvarra later than usual, her cheeks still flushed with fresh air and something that looked unmistakably like happiness. She found Alaric in the drawing room, standing near the window with a stillness that immediately put her on guard. "You're home early," she said, removing her gloves. "I went to Ashcombe this morning." Her hand stopped. "Did you?" "I saw you outside the chapel." His voice was carefully flat, the way a man's voice goes flat when he is working very hard to keep it from becoming something else. "With Mr. Hale, I believe. The stable boy was kind enough to inform me who he was." Alina felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, though she kept her expression composed through years of practice. "Julian volunteers with the charity. He's become a friend." "A friend," Alaric repeated. "You were laughing with him, touching his arm, in full view of the entire village. Is there something wrong with that?" "I don't know," he said, and for the first time since he'd returned from war, his voice cracked slightly, betraying something raw beneath the careful control. "Is there? You tell me, Alina, because from where I stood it looked like considerably more than friendship." She felt something hot rise in her chest, not shame, but something closer to anger, sharpened by weeks of swallowed hurt. "And if it were more? What business would that be of yours? You live under my roof." "I live under your roof because your father took pity on an orphan and your kindness has never once let me forget the debt," she said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, sharper than she had ever let herself speak to him before. "You made it very clear in front of your aunt exactly what I am to you, family, nothing more. So forgive me if I've decided that a man who looks at me without weighing what I owe him, without measuring every kindness against some invisible ledger of gratitude, might be worth my time." The room went silent enough to hear the fire crackling in the grate. Alaric stared at her, stunned into stillness, the accusation landing somewhere he hadn't braced for. "That isn't Alina, that isn't what I meant when I said that." "Then what did you mean?" He opened his mouth and found, for the first time in his life, that he had no answer ready. The truth sat heavy and unspoken behind his teeth, that he had said the word family out of panic, out of fear of what his aunt would make of the truth, out of a cowardice he had not even recognized in himself until this exact moment, watching Alina's eyes burn with a hurt he had caused and refused, until now, to properly see. "I don't know what I meant," he admitted finally, quietly. "I only know that watching you with him today felt like losing something I hadn't realized I still had a claim to." "You have no claim to me, Alaric." Her voice softened slightly, though the hurt remained clear beneath it. "You made certain of that yourself. You cannot say the word family to your aunt and then stand in your own drawing room asking why I've found comfort somewhere else." "I'm not asking why, I'm asking you to stop." The demand hung in the air between them, too honest, too raw, revealing far more than Alaric had intended. Alina stared at him, searching his face for the meaning behind the words, but found only confusion there, a man wrestling with something he clearly did not yet understand himself. "You don't get to ask that," she said finally, gently, though the gentleness did nothing to soften the finality of it. "Not until you understand why you want to." She left him standing alone in the drawing room, the fire burning low, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on him harder than any battle he had survived in his years away. He sank into the chair by the window and stayed there long after the house had gone dark, replaying the sound of her laughter outside the chapel, the easy way she had touched Julian Hale's arm, the terrible, hollow ache that had settled into his chest and refused, no matter how he reasoned with himself, to be explained away as anything other than exactly what it was. 3 days later, Julian Hale called at Penvarra Hall for the first time, ostensibly to discuss a shipment of timber for the estate's repairs, though everyone in the house, from the butler to the youngest maid, understood the visit had little to do with lumber. Alaric received him in the study, with the cold, measured courtesy of a man determined not to reveal anything. "Your Grace," Julian said, extending a hand with the same easy confidence he seemed to carry everywhere. "Good of you to see me." "Mr. Hale," Alaric shook his hand briefly, "I understand you've become well acquainted with my ward." "I have. She's a remarkable woman." "I imagine you know that better than anyone, having known her so long." "I do," Alaric said, and something in his tone made Julian's easy expression falter slightly, sensing, perhaps, that the conversation carried weight beyond the timber contracts they were meant to be discussing. "Your Grace, if I may speak plainly," Julian said, setting aside the pretense entirely. "I've come to admire Miss Marchetti a great deal these past weeks. I intend to make my feelings known to her properly when the time is right. I thought it only fair you should hear it from me directly, rather than from village gossip." Alaric's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression carefully still. "That's very direct of you." "Life's short, Your Grace. I've never seen the sense in being anything else." The words landed with an odd familiarity, though Alaric couldn't place why, and he studied the merchant across from him with something close to grudging respect fighting against the jealousy still burning in his chest. Here was a man who said exactly what he meant, without hiding behind titles or careful distance or the word family spoken to avoid a harder truth. "And if I told you her future was already spoken for," Alaric said, testing the words even as he spoke them, uncertain if he had the right to claim them. Julian's expression sharpened slightly. "Is it? Because from what Alina has told me and what the whole village seems to know, you've made it quite clear she's like a sister to you, nothing more. A man doesn't get to stand in the way of a woman's happiness after saying words like that, Your Grace. Not honorably, anyway." The accusation struck harder than Alaric expected, precisely because it was true, and he had no honest defense against it. He sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, and finally said quietly, "You're right. I have no claim to stand in your way." But even as he said it, something in him refused to accept the words as final, and long after Julian Hale had left the estate with a polite goodbye and a promise to return, Alaric sat alone in his study, staring at the fire, finally admitting to himself the truth he had been running from since the moment Alina stepped out of that carriage's shadow. 6 years transformed and changed him without either of them realizing it at the time. He was not jealous because a stranger had won Alina's affection through simple honesty. He was jealous because a stranger had said, in a single afternoon, everything Alaric had spent 6 years too afraid to say at all. The days that followed settled into a strange, brittle quiet at Penvarra Hall, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from two people carefully avoiding a conversation both of them know is waiting. Alina continued her work at Ashcombe, though she found herself watching the road back to the estate with a heaviness she hadn't felt before, a tension that hadn't existed until Alaric's confrontation in the drawing room had cracked something open between them that neither seemed willing to name. Julian remained warm, attentive, entirely himself, and she told herself repeatedly that his steadiness was exactly what she needed, exactly what she had gone looking for the day she wrote that letter to the Charity Society. But steadiness, she was beginning to learn, was not the same as the breathless, unsettled feeling that overtook her whenever Alaric Penvarra looked at her the way he had that evening in the drawing room, like a man finally seeing something he had spent years refusing to look at directly. She hated how much that feeling still meant to her. Alaric, for his part, had thrown himself into estate business with a ferocity that left even the most seasoned stewards struggling to keep pace, riding out to inspect tenant farms he hadn't visited since his return, reviewing ledgers late into the night, doing anything at all that might keep his mind from circling back to the image of Alina's hand resting easily on Julian Hale's arm. It did not work, nothing worked. Edmund found him one gray afternoon in the estate's east field, standing at the edge of a fence line, staring at nothing in particular, while a tenant farmer waited patiently to discuss a matter of drainage that Alaric had clearly stopped listening to several minutes earlier. "You've become a very poor duke this week," Edmund observed once the farmer had given up and wandered off. "Distracted, short-tempered. I heard you snapped at poor Mrs. Hale over a laundry schedule yesterday, which frankly seems beneath you, cousin, even in your current state." "I apologized to Mrs. Hale. I'm sure she appreciated it. It doesn't change the fact that you're miserable, and everyone in this house knows exactly why, even if you've spent considerable effort pretending otherwise." Alaric didn't answer, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead, and Edmund, undeterred, pressed on. "Julian Hale came to see you. He told you his intentions, and instead of doing anything sensible about it, you've spent the last 3 days riding this estate half to death and biting the head off anyone who mentions Alina's name at dinner. That's not the behavior of a man who feels nothing, Alaric." "I told him he had no obstacle from me." "Did you mean it?" The question hung there, simple and precise, and Alaric found he could not answer it honestly, not even to himself, not yet. "I don't know what I mean anymore," he admitted finally. "I called her family in front of Aunt Cordelia because it was easier than admitting the truth. I've spent 6 years telling myself that what I feel for Alina is loyalty, gratitude, the natural affection of a childhood friendship. And now I watch her walk away toward a stranger who says exactly what he means without flinching, and I realize I've spent 6 years being a coward, and I don't know how to undo that kind of damage in 3 days." Edmund studied his cousin for a long moment, something almost gentle in his expression. "Then you'd better learn quickly, Alaric, because from what I hear in the village, Julian Hale doesn't intend to wait very long before he asks for her hand properly. And if you let her go now, out of fear or pride or whatever else has kept your mouth shut all these years, you'll spend the rest of your life standing in fields like this one, staring at nothing, wondering what might have happened if you'd simply told her the truth when you had the chance." That night, Alina sat in the small garden behind the charity house in Ashcombe, having stayed later than usual to help close accounts for the week, when Julian found her there, the last light fading behind the hills. "You've been quiet all evening," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I've had a great deal on my mind. The Duke, I imagine." He said it without bitterness, simply an observation offered with the same easy honesty he brought to everything. You don't have to pretend with me, Alina. I've seen the way your face changes whenever his name comes up. I'm not blind, and I'd rather know the truth than build something on a foundation that isn't solid. She turned to him, startled by his directness even after weeks of knowing him. Julian, You don't owe me an explanation tonight, he said gently. But I will say this. I care for you a great deal, more than I've cared for anyone in a long while, and I'd like the chance to know whether that could become something lasting between us. But I need you to be certain, Alina, before I ask you anything further. I won't compete with a man's shadow, however much that shadow might still be standing in your way. His kindness, so plainly offered, undid something in her that she'd been holding tightly closed for days. I don't know what I want, she admitted quietly. I thought I did. I thought coming here, finding this work, finding you, meant I had finally found a life that belonged entirely to me. And I still believe that, Julian. I do. But there are things at Penvarra I haven't fully let go of, and I think it would be unfair to you to pretend otherwise. Julian nodded slowly, absorbing this with the same steady grace that had drawn her to him in the first place. Then take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, Alina, but I'll ask you to remember something, whatever you decide. A life spent waiting for someone who's too afraid to claim you isn't a life at all. It's simply waiting, and you deserve more than that, whoever you choose in the end. She left Ashcombe that evening with his words settled deep in her chest, turning them over the entire ride back to Penvarra, and by the time she reached the estate, the great house rising dark and familiar against the evening sky, she had made a quiet decision of her own. She would give Alaric one final chance to speak the truth, whatever that truth might be. And if he could not, or would not, then she would let him go entirely and build the rest of her life on ground that did not depend on a man too frightened to claim what he wanted. She found him waiting in the entrance hall when she arrived, as though he had been standing there for some time, and something in his expression, uncertain and searching, told her he had reached a decision of his own that evening as well. Alina, he said, stepping forward, I need to speak with you tonight if you'll allow it. I was hoping you would, she said quietly, and followed him into the study, neither of them certain yet whether the conversation waiting there would mend what had broken between them or finally, irreversibly, tear it apart. The fire had burned low by the time they sat, and for a long moment neither spoke, the silence stretching thin and fragile between them. I spoke with Edmund today, Alaric began, choosing his words with visible care. He told me something I already knew but hadn't been brave enough to say aloud. That I've spent 6 years calling what I feel for you something safe, something easy to explain to my aunt, to the staff, to myself. And that safety has cost me more than I realized, watching you walk towards someone who was never afraid to say what he meant. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Alaric. Let me finish, he said, and something in his voice made her still. I don't know yet how to say this properly. I've rehearsed it a dozen times riding home tonight and every version sounds wrong, too small for what I actually feel. But I know that watching you with Julian Hale broke something open in me that I can't close again. And I know that the word family was never the right word, not once, not for 6 years. She wanted desperately to hear him finish it, to say plainly what she had waited so long to hear. But at that exact moment, a sharp knock sounded at the study door, and before either of them could respond, Edmund burst in, breathless and pale. Alaric, forgive the intrusion, but a rider's just come from the North Tenant Farms. There's been a fire in the grain stores. They need you there tonight, before the wind spreads it further. The moment shattered instantly, urgency crowding out everything that had been building between them. Alaric rose immediately, torn between the crisis demanding his attention and the conversation he had finally worked up the courage to finish. Alina, Go, she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the loss of what had almost been said. Your tenants need you. We'll speak when you return. He hesitated only a moment longer before following Edmund out into the night, and Alina sat alone in the study long after the sound of hooves had faded, replaying his unfinished words, wondering whether they would ever find their way back to this exact moment again. The fire at the North Farms burned through most of the night, and Alaric returned near dawn, exhausted, soot-streaked, having spent hours alongside his tenants fighting the flames with a determination that earned him more genuine respect from the farming families than any speech or ledger ever could have. But by the time he returned, Alina had already left for Ashcombe, called away early by an urgent message about flood damage that required her immediate attention, and the conversation they had both been waiting to finish remained, once again, suspended. It was during this same week that Julian Hale, sensing perhaps that time was slipping away from him, made his decision. He arrived at the charity house on a bright morning with a small bouquet of wildflowers, awkward in his hands in a way that seemed entirely unlike his usual easy confidence. "Alina," he said, finding her sorting linens near the back window, "I've thought a great deal about what you said about needing time, and I respect that, I do. But I find I'm not a patient man where you're concerned, and I'd rather know where I stand than continue wondering." She set down the linens, sensing what was coming, her chest tightening with a mixture of dread and affection for the man standing before her. "I'm asking you to marry me, Alina," he said simply, without elaborate speeches or grand gestures, just the plain honesty that had drawn her to him from their very first meeting. "I can't offer you a title or a great house, but I can offer you a life where you're never made to feel like a burden, never made to wonder whether you're wanted. I can offer you a home built on nothing but choice, freely given, every single day." The words struck her harder than she expected, precisely because they were everything she had told herself she wanted, everything Alaric's careless words in that drawing room had convinced her she would never find inside Penvarra's walls. "Julian," she said softly, "I need to think. Please understand, this isn't a small thing you're asking." "I understand completely," he said, and the gentleness in his voice, the complete absence of pressure or hurt pride, made her ache with how easy it would be to simply say yes and let the rest of her uncertain feelings quietly settle into something manageable. "Take whatever time you need. But know that my answer won't change, whenever you're ready to give me yours." She left Ashcombe that afternoon carrying the weight of his proposal like a stone in her chest, and by the time she reached the gardens of Penvarra Hall, the evening light turning everything gold and uncertain around her, she found herself standing once again at the old stone bench where she and Alaric had sat as children, staring out at a future that suddenly felt impossibly complicated. She did not know that Alaric had watched her arrival from his study window, had seen the careful, troubled expression on her face, and had felt, without knowing why exactly, a cold certainty settle into his stomach that something significant had shifted while he had been consumed by the fire at the North Farms. He found her there an hour later, still sitting on the bench, staring at nothing in particular. "You look troubled," he said, settling beside her with careful distance, mindful of the interrupted conversation still hanging between them. "Julian asked me to marry him." The words landed like a physical blow, though Alaric kept his expression carefully still through sheer force of will. "I see. I haven't given him an answer. But you're considering it." "I don't know what I'm considering," she admitted, turning to face him fully for the first time since the fire had interrupted them days before. "I know that Julian offers me certainty, Alaric. He offers me a life where I never have to wonder whether I'm wanted, where I never have to weigh my worth against a title or a family name. And I know that whatever you were trying to say to me the other night remains unfinished, and I can't keep waiting indefinitely for words that might never come." "They'll come," he said, more forcefully than he intended, reaching for her hand before he could stop himself. "Alina, please, give me a little more time. I know I've handled this badly, I know I've hurt you with my carelessness, but I'm asking you not to give Julian your answer until I've had the chance to finish what I started saying to you that night." She looked down at his hand covering hers, warm and familiar and achingly wanted despite everything, and felt the careful walls she'd built over the past weeks begin, dangerously, to crack. "How much time, Alaric?" "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I know that if you marry Julian Hale without hearing everything I have to say first, I will spend the rest of my life regretting every moment I spent too afraid to claim you properly. Give me until the harvest ball. One more week. If I haven't found the courage to say everything I need to say by then, I'll accept whatever answer you give Julian, and I'll never stand in your way again." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the truth beneath his words, and found there, finally, something that looked less like careful denial and more like genuine fear. The fear of a man finally facing the full weight of what he stood to lose. "1 week," she agreed quietly. "But Alaric, I need you to understand something. I can't keep living in the space between your fear and your feelings. Whatever you decide, I need it to be certain. I've spent too much of my life being grateful for whatever kindness people were willing to spare me. I won't spend the rest of it that way too." "I understand," he said, and meant it more completely than he had meant anything in years. "You deserve certainty, Alina. I intend to give it to you, whatever it costs me." They sat together in the fading light a while longer, the unfinished conversation still hovering between them, but something had shifted in the silence. A fragile hope, carefully guarded on both sides, that perhaps there was still time enough left to say the things that mattered most, before the choice was taken entirely out of their hands. News of the harvest ball spread quickly through the county, as it did every year, but this season it carried an added weight of anticipation that had nothing to do with the harvest itself. Word had traveled, as word always does in places where everyone knows everyone else's business, that the young Duke of Penvarra had finally decided to make his intentions known, though precisely whose intentions and toward whom remained a matter of considerable village speculation. Cordelia arrived 4 days before the ball, unable to resist the pull of unfolding drama, and installed herself in the best guest room with the clear intention of overseeing every detail of the preparations. "You seem different this week, Alaric," she observed over breakfast, studying her nephew with the same sharp attention she brought to everything. "Less troubled than when I last visited. Have you finally settled on a suitable match for the season?" "I've settled on being honest, Aunt Cordelia. That's all I can promise you for now." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, though her gaze drifted meaningfully toward Alina, who sat quietly at the far end of the table, and something in her expression suggested she had already guessed considerably more than she was letting on. Alina spent those 4 days in a state of careful suspension, dividing her time between Penvarra and Ashcombe, unable to fully commit her heart to either the promise Alaric had made or the certainty Julian continued to offer. Julian, for his part, remained patient, though she caught him watching her with a quiet, searching concern whenever she arrived distracted or troubled from the estate. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share," he said gently, one afternoon as they worked together sorting the last of the flood relief supplies. "But I want you to know, Alina, whatever happens at that ball, whatever you decide, I won't think less of you for taking your time. Love isn't something that should be rushed into out of fear of losing it." "You're very generous, Julian." "I'm very fond of you," he corrected, with a small, honest smile. "Generosity has very little to do with it." Back at Penvarra, Alaric found himself pacing his study late into the night, drafting and discarding a dozen versions of what he intended to say. He had never struggled with words before, not in negotiations with tenant farmers, not in the careful diplomacy required of a returning soldier navigating a household in mourning, not even in the chaos of battle, where clear thinking had often meant the difference between life and death. But here, faced with the simple task of telling Alina Marchetti the truth of his own heart, he found himself utterly, maddeningly at a loss. You're overthinking this, Edmund told him, finding his cousin surrounded by crumpled paper on the third night before the ball. You don't need a speech, Alaric. You need honesty. The two aren't the same thing, and I think you've spent so long being careful with your words around her that you've forgotten how to simply say what's true. And if the truth costs me everything, if she's already decided in her heart to accept Julian, regardless of what I say, then at least she'll know, Edmund said simply. And you'll know you didn't lose her to your own cowardice. There are worse things than losing someone, Alaric. Losing them because you were too afraid to try is the worst of all. The night of the harvest ball arrived clear and cold, the great hall of Penvarra transformed with candlelight and autumn garlands. The entire county gathered in their finest to celebrate the season's end. Alina dressed carefully that evening, choosing a gown the color of deep amber that Julian had once told her matched exactly the color of the evening sky over Ashcombe's river, though she told herself, dressing, that the choice had nothing to do with him at all. She descended the staircase to find the hall already filling with guests, laughter and music rising warm through the great house, and caught sight of Alaric near the entrance, resplendent in formal dress, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room with an intensity that made her breath catch despite every careful wall she had built around her heart. But before either of them could move toward the other, Julian arrived, having been invited by Alina herself weeks earlier, before the full weight of everything unspoken between her and Alaric had come crashing back into focus. He crossed the room directly to her side, warm and easy as always, and took her hand with a familiarity that drew more than a few curious glances from the assembled guests. "You look beautiful tonight," he said quietly for her ears alone, "though I suspect you already know that." Across the room, Alaric watched Julian's hand close around Alina's, watched her smile in response, and felt every carefully rehearsed word he had prepared over the past 4 days scatter completely from his mind. Cordelia, standing nearby, followed his gaze and sighed with the particular exasperation of a woman who had seen this exact drama play out 100 times in 100 other households. "Go and speak with her, Alaric," she said quietly, surprising him with the gentleness in her voice. "I know what I said weeks ago about scandal and propriety. I was wrong to press so hard, and I suspect my pressing had more to do with your unfortunate answer than either of us realized at the time. Don't let pride cost you the one thing your father would have wanted for you above everything else." "What's that?" "Happiness," she said simply. "Real happiness, Alaric, not the careful, dutiful kind we're all taught to settle for. I've watched you these past weeks, and I've watched her too. Don't waste this evening pretending you don't know exactly what you feel." The music shifted into a slower song, couples beginning to gather for the evening's first formal dance, and Alaric, drawing on courage he wasn't entirely certain he possessed, crossed the room directly to where Alina stood beside Julian. "Might I request the next dance, Miss Marchetti?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough formality to mask the tremor beneath it. "If Mr. Hale doesn't object." Julian studied him for a long moment, something knowing passing across his expression, before he stepped back with a small, gracious nod. "Of course. I believe this conversation has been a long time coming, Your Grace." Alina placed her hand in Alaric's, and as the music swelled around them and the other couples began to move, she felt the familiar warmth of his touch settle over her like something she had been missing without fully realizing how much. "You promised me answers tonight," she said quietly, as they moved together through the steps of the dance. "I know," he said, "and I intend to give them. But not here, Alina, not with half the county watching and my aunt's sharp eyes following every step. Give me a few minutes alone with you once the dance ends. What I have to say deserves more privacy than a crowded ballroom." She nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear she could barely contain, and as the dance drew to its close, Alaric led her quietly toward the terrace doors, away from the noise and light of the celebration, toward whatever truth waited for them both in the cold, clear autumn night beyond. But as they reached the terrace, a commotion rose suddenly from the ballroom behind them, raised voices, a crash of something breaking, and Cordelia's sharp cry cutting clearly through the music. Alaric turned instinctively toward the sound, torn once again between the conversation he had finally worked up the courage to finish, and whatever crisis had erupted in his absence. "Go," Elena said softly, though the disappointment in her voice was impossible to fully hide. "I'll wait for you here." He hesitated only a moment before hurrying back inside, and Elena stood alone on the terrace, wrapped in the cold night air, staring out at the dark gardens below and wondering, with a growing ache in her chest, whether fate itself seemed determined to keep them from ever finishing what had been started. Inside, Alaric found the source of the commotion near the refreshment table, where a young footman had stumbled while carrying a heavy tray of crystal glasses, sending shards scattering across the polished floor and startling several of the older guests. It was nothing serious, nothing that truly required the Duke's personal attention, but by the time order had been restored and the frightened footman reassured that his position was not in jeopardy over a simple accident, a full quarter-hour had passed, and Cordelia had cornered Alaric with a fresh round of introductions to eligible young ladies visiting from a neighboring county. Introductions he could not politely refuse without drawing exactly the kind of attention he had spent all evening trying to avoid. By the time he finally extracted himself and made his way back toward the terrace, Elena was gone. He searched the gardens briefly, calling her name into the darkness, but found only silence and the distant sound of the ball continuing behind him. A passing maid informed him, apologetically, that Miss Marchetti had asked for her carriage nearly 20 minutes earlier, claiming a sudden headache, and had already departed toward Ashcombe. Alaric stood alone in the cold garden, the weight of yet another missed chance settling heavily over him, and felt, for the first time since his return from war, something close to despair. What he did not know, standing there in the dark, was that Elena had not gone to Ashcombe seeking distance from him at all, but rather seeking Julian, needing badly to speak with someone whose feelings, at least, had never once wavered or been interrupted by circumstance. She found him at the charity house late that night, having walked from where his own carriage had dropped him after the ball, still dressed in his formal clothes, looking somehow both out of place and entirely himself among the modest furnishings he had come to call his second home. "I didn't expect to see you tonight," he said, surprised, setting down the ledger he had been reviewing by candlelight. "I thought you'd still be at the ball." "I needed to think," she admitted, sitting heavily across from him. Alaric asked for a dance, asked for a private conversation. We were interrupted again before he could say whatever he intended to say. And I found myself standing alone on that terrace, Julian, wondering how many more interruptions I meant to accept before I simply stopped waiting. Julian studied her carefully, and something gentle but resolute settled into his expression. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, whatever the answer costs either of us." If Alaric had finished what he meant to say tonight, if he had told you plainly that he loved you, what would you have said? The question struck her with unexpected force, and she found she could not answer it quickly, could not brush it aside with practiced composure the way she had learned to handle so many difficult questions over the years. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I think that frightens me more than anything, Julian, because if I truly wanted to marry you, if my heart were fully settled, I think I would know the answer immediately. I think it would be simple." Julian nodded slowly, the honesty in her answer clearly costing him something, though he bore it with the same quiet grace that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Then I have my answer, don't I, even if you haven't fully admitted it to yourself yet? Julian, I'm so sorry. You deserve someone whose heart isn't divided, someone who can give you everything without hesitation." "Don't apologize," he said, reaching across to take her hand gently, the gesture more comforting than romantic now, tinged with the particular sadness of a man releasing something he had genuinely hoped to keep. "I knew from the very beginning that there was a shadow in your heart I couldn't fully compete with. I hoped, perhaps foolishly, That time and honesty might change that. But I've never been a man who believes in holding on to something that isn't fully mine to hold, Alina. You deserve to go and find out, finally, whether that shadow is something worth chasing or something you need to let go of entirely, one way or another. I don't want to lose your friendship, whatever happens. You won't, he said, with a small, genuine smile despite the sadness in his eyes. I'm rather fond of you, remember. Fondness like that doesn't simply disappear because a proposal goes unanswered. Go back to Penvarra, Alina. Finish the conversation that fire and clumsy footmen keep interrupting. And whatever the answer turns out to be, know that you have a friend here in Ashcombe who wishes you nothing but genuine happiness. She left the charity house that night with tears in her eyes, grateful beyond words for Julian's understanding, and carrying with her a new, fierce clarity about what she needed to do next. She would not wait any longer for circumstance to decide her future for her. She would go to Penvarra, find Alaric, and demand, once and for all, the truth he had promised her weeks ago and failed, through fire and accident and cowardice alike, to fully deliver. But when she arrived back at the estate near midnight, the ball long since ended and the great house settling into quiet, she found the study empty, Alaric's bed unslept in, and a note left hastily on his desk explaining that urgent business had called him away before dawn to the northern property line, where a dispute with a neighboring landholder over grazing rights had escalated into something requiring his immediate personal attention. Alina stood alone in the empty study, staring at the note, and felt something inside her finally, quietly break. She had spent weeks accepting interruption after interruption, fire after crisis after careless accident, each one stealing away the conversation she needed more than anything to finish. And now, on the very night she had finally found the courage to demand answers, he was gone again, called away by circumstances entirely beyond either of their control. She sat down heavily in his chair, exhausted in a way that went far beyond the late hour, and made a decision that felt in that moment like the only sensible thing left to do. She would not chase him any further. She would not spend another week suspended between fear and hope, waiting for a truth that circumstance seemed determined never to let her hear. If Alaric Penvarra truly wanted her, truly loved her the way his eyes had suggested all evening, he would have to come find her and say it plainly, without excuse, without interruption, without another single delay. And if he did not, if the northern property line and the endless demands of his title proved, once again, more important than finishing what he had started, then she would finally, fully accept that some things were simply never meant to be, however much her heart insisted otherwise, and she would build the rest of her life on ground that did not depend on waiting for a man who could not, or would not, choose her plainly and completely. She left the study before dawn, before the household had fully woken, and began quietly making arrangements of her own, a visit to a distant aunt in the north, ostensibly to consider her own independent future, a future that did not depend on Penvarra Hall or the uncertain heart of the man who ruled it. By the time Alaric returned 3 days later, exhausted from resolving the boundary dispute and desperate to finally finish the conversation that had eluded them both for weeks, he found Penvarra Hall quieter than he had ever known it, and Alina, the heart and steady hand of the entire household, gone. Gone where? He demanded of the housekeeper, Mrs. Hale, who wrung her hands nervously under the intensity of his questioning. North, Your Grace, to visit a distant aunt of hers, she said. She left instructions for the household in case you asked, and a letter for you, sitting on your desk. Alaric strode to his study with a speed that startled the entire staff, and found the letter exactly where Mrs. Hale had promised, sealed simply with Alina's familiar, neat handwriting across the front. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal, and he read her words with a growing, hollow dread that settled deeper into his chest with every line. Alaric, the letter began, I have waited weeks now for the truth you promised me the night of the fire, and every time we come close, something intervenes, duty, accident, circumstance itself seeming determined to keep us apart. I no longer believe this is simple bad fortune. I believe, perhaps, that some part of both of us has been using these interruptions as an excuse to avoid a truth neither of us feels fully ready to face. I have gone north to think, away from Penvarra, away from Ashcombe, away from every voice telling me who I should become or what I should want. I need to discover on my own what I actually feel, separate from the fear of losing you and separate from the comfort Julian offered so freely. I owe myself that clarity, after years of measuring my worth against what others were willing to give me. If you truly meant what your eyes suggested that night at the ball, I ask that you come and tell me plainly, without interruption, without another crisis pulling you away at the crucial moment. My aunt's address is enclosed below. But Alaric, I will not wait forever. I have spent too much of my life waiting quietly for scraps of certainty from people who claim to care for me. I deserve better than that, and so, I think, do you, whatever you ultimately decide. Whatever happens, know that Penvarra Hall will always hold a piece of my heart, and so, I think, despite everything, will you. Elena. Alaric sat in stunned silence for a long moment after finishing the letter, the weight of every missed chance, every interrupted conversation, every moment of careless cowardice crashing down on him at once. He thought of his father, dead now more than a year, who had taken in a frightened orphan girl without a second thought and raised her as his own, teaching her, without ever meaning to, that love given freely asked for nothing in return. He thought of the word family, spoken so carelessly in his aunt's presence, and understood now, with painful clarity, exactly how deeply those 4 words had wounded the one person who had never once asked anything of him beyond honesty. He thought, too, of Julian Hale, standing in his study weeks ago, saying plainly what Alaric himself had been too afraid to voice. Life's short. I've never seen the sense in being anything else. Edmund found him still sitting there an hour later, the letter clutched in his hands, staring at nothing. You look like a man who's finally understood something important, Edmund observed quietly, settling into the chair across from him. I've been a fool, Edmund. A complete and utter fool. I let fear and duty and every excuse imaginable keep me from telling her the one thing that actually mattered, and now she's gone, and I don't know if I still have the right to go after her. Of course you have the right, Edmund said firmly. The only question is whether you have the courage. You've spent 6 years, cousin, letting circumstance and propriety and the weight of this title dictate every decision that actually mattered to your own heart. Elena has given you exactly what you need now, a clear path, an honest request, and a warning that her patience isn't infinite. Don't waste it standing here feeling sorry for yourself. Alaric looked up at his cousin, something resolute finally settling into his expression. You're right, I've wasted enough time already. He left within the hour, riding north with a small traveling party and a determination that surprised even himself, pushing through 2 days of hard travel with barely a pause for rest, driven by the fear that every additional hour might be the hour that finally exhausted Elena's patience entirely. Along the way, he had ample time to think, and think he did, turning over every memory of the past 6 years with a clarity he had never allowed himself before. He thought of Elena as a girl, quietly managing household accounts far beyond her years, never once complaining about the responsibility thrust upon her. He thought of her laughter in the garden, her quiet strength through his father's illness and death, the way she had held the entire household together during his long absence at war without ever once asking for recognition or reward. He thought, too, of every moment he had pulled back from her, every time he had chosen careful distance over honest feeling, out of fear of scandal, out of fear of his aunt's judgment, out of fear, most simply, of being wrong about what he felt and losing the safety of their careful friendship entirely. But watching her walk away toward Julian Hale had taught him something he could not unlearn. That safety built on silence was no safety at all, only a slower, quieter kind of loss. By the time he reached the modest cottage where Elena's aunt resided, nestled in a small village at the edge of a wide, quiet lake, he was travel-worn and exhausted, but more certain of his purpose than he had been about anything in years. Alina's aunt, a kind, sharp-eyed woman named Margaret, opened the door and studied him for a long moment before stepping aside to let him enter. "You must be the Duke," she said, not unkindly, though her tone carried a clear note of warning. "Alina's told me a great deal about you these past few days. Some of it flattering, I'll admit, and some of it considerably less so." "I deserve the less flattering parts, I imagine." "You do," Margaret agreed frankly. "She's out walking by the lake if you're looking for her. But Your Grace, I'll ask you plainly before you go find her. Are you here because you've finally decided what you want, or are you here because you're afraid of losing something familiar and don't yet know the difference between fear and love?" The question struck Alaric with unexpected force, precisely because it was fair, precisely because he had spent so many weeks unable to fully answer it himself. But standing there, having traveled 2 hard days without rest, having finally read the truth of his own heart clearly in Alina's careful, honest letter, he found the answer came to him now without hesitation. "I know the difference now," he said quietly. "It took me far too long to learn it, and I understand if she no longer believes me capable of it. But I love her, Mrs. Margaret. Not as family, not out of duty or gratitude or the comfortable habit of 6 years' friendship. I love her the way a man loves someone he cannot imagine building a life without, and I intend to tell her exactly that, if she'll still allow me the chance." Margaret studied him a moment longer, something softening slightly in her sharp expression, before she gestured toward the path leading down to the lake. "Then I suggest you go and tell her, Your Grace, before your courage finds some new excuse to fail you." Alaric thanked her and set off down the path immediately, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear more intense than anything he had felt even in the chaos of battle. And as the lake came into view, silver and still beneath the afternoon sun, he caught sight of Alina standing alone at the water's edge, and understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity that everything that mattered most in his entire life was standing right there, waiting, whether she fully realized it yet or not, for him to finally, completely, and without a single reservation claim her. She heard his footsteps on the path before she turned, some instinct recognizing his particular stride even before her eyes confirmed it, and when she finally faced him, standing travel-worn and wind-blown at the edge of her aunt's quiet lake, something in her chest tightened with a hope she had been carefully guarding against for days. "You came," she said simply, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "I came the moment I read your letter," he said, closing the distance between them slowly, as though approaching something precious and easily frightened away. "I should have come sooner. I should have said everything I needed to say weeks ago, the very first night I saw you laughing with Julian outside that chapel and felt something in me break at the thought of losing you. Instead, I let fear and duty and every excuse imaginable keep me silent, and I am so deeply sorry for the pain that silence has caused you." "Alaric, please," he said gently, "let me finish. I've rehearsed this 100 times on the ride here, and I'm terrified that if I stop now, I'll lose my courage entirely." He took a breath, steadying himself, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before, not even in their most honest moments together. "I called you family in front of my aunt because it was safe. Because admitting the truth felt like standing at the edge of something enormous, something that could change everything between us, and I wasn't brave enough yet to take that step. But Alina, you have never once in 6 years felt like family to me. Not the way I felt about my father or Edmund or anyone else I've ever called kin. What I feel for you is entirely different, and I have been lying to myself and to you for far too long by pretending otherwise." She stood very still, watching him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it over the quiet lapping of the lake against the shore. "I love you," he said finally, the words simple and unadorned, stripped of every careful evasion he had hidden behind for years. "I have loved you, I think, since long before I understood what the word truly meant. I loved you as a girl running this household with a steadiness that put grown men to shame. I loved you standing beside me through my father's illness, through the long silence of my years away at war, through every quiet, ordinary moment we shared without either of us ever naming what was actually happening between us. And I love you now, standing here at this lake, having traveled 2 days without rest because the thought of losing you to someone else's honesty, when I had 6 years to find my own, was more than I could bear. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she made no move to brush them away, too caught up in the weight of finally hearing the words she had waited so long for. Why? She asked softly, though there was no anger left in the question now, only a genuine need to understand. Why did it take watching me with Julian? Why did it take weeks of interruption and near loss for you to finally say what you've apparently felt all along? Because I was a coward, he said plainly, without excuse or deflection. Because admitting I loved you meant admitting that the safe, careful life I'd built for myself since returning from war wasn't safe at all, not really, not if it meant losing you to my own silence. I told myself calling you family was protecting you, protecting us both from scandal and complication. But the truth is, Alina, I was protecting myself. I was afraid of exactly this moment, afraid of standing in front of you and being told I was too late, that whatever chance I once had was already gone. And if I had already given Julian my answer, if I had chosen him before you found the courage to come here. Alaric's expression tightened with the pain of the possibility, though he did not flinch from it. Then I would have accepted it, however much it cost me. I would have wished you every happiness because you deserve happiness, Alina, whether it comes from me or from someone braver than I managed to be for far too long. But I am here now because you gave me a clear path and an honest warning, and because some part of me refused to let this be the story of my life, the story of a man who loved someone completely and let fear cost him everything that actually mattered. Alina stepped closer, closing the last small distance between them, her heart finally, fully open after weeks of careful, guarded protection. Julian and I are no longer engaged in that way, Alaric. I ended things gently days ago, before you ever wrote a single word of that letter for me to find. He understood, I think, before I fully did myself, that my heart had never completely left this house, however far I tried to run from it. Relief and hope flooded through Alaric so completely that he had to steady himself, reaching for her hands with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have. Then tell me plainly, Alina, what your own heart wants, not what duty suggests, not what gratitude demands, just you, standing here, telling me the truth. She looked up at him, 6 years of careful restraint finally, completely dissolving, and answered without a single moment's hesitation. I want you, Alaric. I have wanted you for longer than I think either of us has been willing to admit. Not as family, not out of habit or gratitude, but simply because you are the one person who has always, somehow, felt like home to me, long before either of us understood what that truly meant. He pulled her gently into his arms, and for the first time since his return from war, Alaric Penvarra felt something settle completely and finally into place. The restless uncertainty of the past months dissolving entirely into the simple, overwhelming certainty of holding the woman he loved without a single word left unsaid between them. I intend to ask you properly, he murmured against her hair, with a ring and my aunt's grudging approval and every formal tradition this ridiculous title demands. But I wanted you to hear the truth first, plainly, without ceremony standing in the way of it. I love you, Alina Marchetti, completely and without a single reservation left. I love you too, she whispered back, tears of relief and happiness finally spilling freely down her cheeks. I have for longer than I think I ever let myself fully admit. They stood together at the edge of the quiet lake as the afternoon light softened around them. 6 years of careful distance finally, completely closed, and neither of them noticed Margaret watching from the cottage window. a small, satisfied smile crossing her sharp features as she turned away to prepare tea for the celebration she suspected, quite correctly, was about to unfold. They returned to Penvarra together a week later, Alina's arm resting easily in Alaric's the entire journey home, neither of them making the slightest effort to hide what had changed between them. The household staff, who had watched the slow, painful unfolding of their story for months with the particular investment servants always take in the private lives of those they serve, greeted the news with open, unrestrained joy. Mrs. Hale wept happy tears in the entrance hall. The young footman who had dropped the tray of crystal glasses at the harvest ball declared, to general laughter, that he had known all along the accident would somehow work out for the best. Edmund, when he heard, simply smiled and said, "Finally," with the satisfaction of a man who had watched two people dance around an obvious truth for far too long. Cordelia's reaction proved more complicated, though ultimately, and somewhat to Alaric's surprise, entirely supportive. She arrived within days of hearing the news, sweeping into the drawing room with her usual dramatic energy, and studied Alina for a long, searching moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology, I think," she said finally, surprising both of them. "I pushed too hard months ago about scandal and propriety, and I believe my pushing had more to do with Alaric's foolish answer than either of us fully understood at the time. I've watched this family go through enough grief and uncertainty these past years. I find I care considerably more about my nephew's actual happiness than about what the neighbors might whisper over an unconventional match." "Thank you, Aunt Cordelia," Alaric said, genuinely moved. "That means more than you know." "Don't thank me yet," she said, with a return of her usual sharp humor. "I still intend to plan an enormous wedding whether either of you wants one or not. A duke doesn't marry quietly, whatever the circumstances of the match. And Alina, my dear, you'll need proper gowns befitting a future duchess. I simply won't allow anything less." Alina laughed genuinely, warmly, and found herself embraced by a woman who had once seemed determined to stand in the way of exactly this outcome, and understood with quiet gratitude that sometimes the people who seem most opposed to happiness are simply frightened by change, and given time and honesty, can become its most enthusiastic champions. News reached Julian Hale within the week, carried by the same efficient village gossip that had once nearly cost Alaric everything. He called at Penvarra Hall himself shortly after, not out of bitterness, but out of genuine warmth, wanting to offer his congratulations in person. "I confess I suspected this outcome, somewhere beneath my own hopes," he told Alina, standing in the same drawing room where Alaric had once carelessly called her family in front of witnesses. "You have a good heart, Alina, and I believe good hearts eventually find their way to where they truly belong, however long the journey takes. I wish you every happiness." "You'll always have a place at Ashcombe in my heart, Julian," she said sincerely, embracing him warmly. "Your kindness during those difficult weeks meant more than I think I properly expressed at the time." "Then express it now," he said, with his familiar easy grin, "by naming your firstborn son after me. I think Julian Penvarra has a fine ring to it." Alaric, standing nearby, laughed despite himself, and extended his hand to the merchant who had, in his own unknowing way, forced him to finally confront the truth of his own heart. "You have my gratitude as well, Mr. Hale, however strange that may sound given the circumstances. You said things to me that day in my study that I needed to hear, however much they stung at the time." "Life's short, your grace," Julian said, shaking his hand firmly. "I meant every word of it then, and I mean it still. I'm glad, in the end, that the two of you finally found the courage to live by it as well." The wedding took place in early spring, in the same chapel outside which Alaric had once watched Alina laugh on Julian's arm, and felt his entire carefully controlled world begin to unravel. The village turned out in full, along with family from every corner of the county, and Alina walked down the aisle in a gown the color of morning light, her chin held high with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every difficult season of her life, from frightened orphan to steady household manager to, finally, a woman claiming without reservation exactly the life and love she deserved. Alaric watched her approach with tears he made no effort to hide, thinking of his father, who had taken in a small, frightened girl out of simple kindness, and could never have known, watching her grow through the years, that he was quietly raising the woman his son would someday love more completely than anything else in his entire life. When the vows were spoken and the chapel bells rang out over Ashcombe, celebrating a match that had taken 6 long years, countless interruptions, and one very necessary confrontation to finally reach its rightful conclusion, Alaric leaned close to Alina's ear, echoing, with entirely different meaning now, the words that had once nearly cost them everything. "You are family to me now," he murmured, smiling against her hair as the crowd cheered around them. "The only family I intend to build for the rest of my life." "Good," she whispered back, laughing through happy tears, "because this time I finally believe you completely." And standing together in the spring sunlight outside the small chapel where their story had nearly unraveled and had instead, against every obstacle circumstance could throw in their path, finally found its proper beginning, Alaric and Alina Penvarra faced the future together, certain at last, after everything, exactly where they belonged.